Hey everybody. What I want to do today is give an introduction into anatomy and physiology. What is anatomy? What is physiology? Well, when we're talking about anatomy, we're talking about the structure of the body. We're talking about the individual body parts, how they're built, and their structural relationship to one another. And then when we talk about physiology, we're talking about the functions of the body, what those parts do, and how they do it. So we can look at the heart as an example. These are all different anatomical parts of the heart. This is all different heart anatomy. And we can see these on these diagrams. This is a frontal view or an anterior view of the heart. And this right here represents the apex. This is the anterior interventricular artery, also known as the widowmaker. Here's the right auricle, left auricle. There's the aorta. There's the pulmonary trunk and the pulmonary arteries. Here's the pulmonary veins coming in the back. The pulmonary trunk is anterior or in front of the aorta. That's an anatomical description. So all of these different parts, this represents different anatomy of the heart. Then when we talk about physiology, we're talking about what the heart does and how it does it. For instance, how electricity is generated by this structure called the SA node, how that electricity spreads throughout the heart, and how that drives contraction of the heart. That's an example of physiology. Another example of physiology is how the heart contracts to generate pressure to actually cause blood to flow through the blood vessels to generate blood pressure and to generate blood flow. So both of those represent physiology. Anatomy deals with the structures of the body parts, and physiology deals with the functions of those parts, what they do and how they do it. And the nervous system is a good place to compare these two different ideas. Compare anatomy and physiology. So the nervous system is composed of billions and billions of neurons, of individual neurons. And this is an individual neuron right here that's making contact with another neuron. So let's compare neuron anatomy with neuron physiology. So all of these different parts represent different parts of the neuron anatomy. We have these antenna-like regions called the dendrites. Here we have the cell body, which includes the nucleus. Then we have this long, slender projection, which goes from the cell body. That's called the axon. Then the axon branches and becomes the axon terminal. And then what happens is the axon terminal makes contact with another neuron. And that's what we're looking at right here. This is the axon terminal from one neuron making contact with another neuron. And we call this area where the two neurons make contact with each other, we call that the chemical synapse. And the neuron is going to release these little molecules, chemical messengers, called neurotransmitters. And that's how one neuron is going to communicate with the next. So all of that represents anatomy. That's all different neuron anatomy. But what about neuron physiology? What do these neurons do and how do they do it? Well, it's these receptive regions these antenna-like regions, the dendrites, that are going to receive receptive information. They're going to receive information from other neurons, for instance. Then they're going to take that information and turn it into an electrical signal. And that electrical signal is going to travel down to the axon, and it's going to turn into an electrical signal called an action potential. And these action potentials are going to be generated all the way down the axon until it gets to the axon terminal. Then, when that action potential gets down to the axon terminal, it's going to open these calcium channels. Calcium is going to flood into the cell, and it's going to cause these vesicles, these storage structures that contain neurotransmitters. It's going to cause those to fuse to the plasma membrane and release those neurotransmitters across the chemical synapse to act on the neuron below that, to act on what we call the postsynaptic neuron. And then what happens is those neurotransmitters, they bind to these receptors. Those receptors open, sodium floods into the postsynaptic neuron, and that generates electricity in the postsynaptic neuron. And that's essentially how neurons communicate with each other. They receive sensory information, or they receive information. They turn that into an electrical signal, and then they release neurotransmitters onto other neurons, which generate that, which turn that into an electrical signal. And that's how neurons communicate with each other. And that represents neuron physiology. Okay, we have the neuron anatomy, what it's built for, and then we have the neuron physiology, what that actually does. And really, anatomy and physiology are inseparable, because how something is built determines what it does. Something's structure determines its function. So that's an important principle in anatomy and physiology, is that structure determines function. How something is built determines what it does. And this important principle is called the complementarity of structure and function. How something is built determines what it does. And there's a couple examples here that I want you to think about and come up with some ideas for about how these represent the complementarity of structure and function. And you can open these questions up to the group discussion and see what other people come up with. So first of all, how does the complementarity of structure and function relate to this sperm? How does the structure of this sperm determine what it does? Okay, what's unique about the structure of this sperm, and how does that determine, or how does it help it to do what it does? Another example I want you to think about is the pelvis, and specifically the female pelvis. So the pelvis are the hip bones. This is the picture of the male hip, and this is a picture of the female hip bones. And I want you to tell me how the structure of the female pelvis allows for its function. Okay, what's different between the male and female pelvis, and how does that determine function of the female pelvis? Another important principle with regards to anatomy and physiology are the levels of anatomical complexity, the levels of biological complexity. And the idea is that here we have an organism, but this organism is built on different layers of structure. We have simple layers of structure, and you build on top of those to create a more complex structure to ultimately create an organism. So let's go through those levels of complexity, those levels of structure. So the first question is, what's going to be the smallest structure that composes the human body? And this is not only the smallest structure that composes the human body, it's the smallest unit of matter on Earth, in the universe. These are the smallest levels of structure that cannot be broken down any further by ordinary chemical means. So what is that level? Those are atoms. Atoms are the smallest unit to make up the human body and really any matter on Earth or in the universe. And some examples of different atoms are individual sodium atoms, individual chloride atoms, hydrogen, oxygen, carbon, nitrogen. You can find all of these different atoms on the periodic table. Actually, these are elements, but an individual element, an individual unit of an element is called an atom. So we have these atoms, which are the smallest level of structure, but then these atoms form chemical bonds with each other. And that leads us to the next level of anatomical complexity, which is the molecular structure. Okay, molecules. So for example, 2 hydrogens and 1 oxygen come together to form a water molecule. You have carbons, oxygens, hydrogens, and nitrogens that form different chemical bonds to make proteins, carbohydrates, and lipids. Then you take those molecules, and those molecules can come together to form what we call organelles. And organelles are structures within a cell that have a specific function. The nucleus, the mitochondria are both examples of organelles. Then you put different organelles together and you surround them by a plasma membrane, and that takes us to the next level, which is the cellular level. And the cellular level is important for a number of reasons. One, these are the structural units of the body. The body is made up of trillions and trillions of individual cells. Cells are also the functional units of the body. Ultimately, the functions of the body occur at the cellular level. The heart contracts because individual cardiocytes, individual heart cells contract. The nervous system is able to communicate information because individual neurons or nerve cells generate electricity and are able to communicate. So they're both the functional and structural units of the body. They're the smallest level that the properties of life emerge at. The next level is when you take groups of cells and those cell products, and those come together to form tissues. And we'll talk about the different types of tissues in this class. But there's epithelial tissues, there's connective tissues, which include cartilage, bone, stuff to that effect, areolar tissue, and then there's also muscular tissue and nervous tissue. So you have the tissue level. Then when you have 2 or more tissues that form a discrete structure that performs a function for the body, that takes us to the next level, which is the organ level. And a blood vessel is considered an organ. It's made of epithelial tissue, different types of connective tissue. There's muscular tissue in there. There's nervous tissue in there. And it comes together, forms a discrete structure, and it performs a function. After the organ level, we get to the organ system level. So this is where you take different organs that work closely together and you put those into an organ system. So for instance, the cardiovascular system. The cardiovascular system not only is composed of blood vessels, but also the heart. And those come together and perform a common function, which is to generate pressure and distribute blood and therefore nutrients and gases throughout the body. And then you take all these different organ systems, you put those together, and ultimately that takes us to the organismal level, which is the most complex level. That's a functioning human being exists at the organismal level. And the reason it's important to know these different levels is because in this class, in anatomy and physiology, sure, we're going to talk about tissues, organs, and organ systems and how all those work together at the organismal level, but we're also going to talk about atoms. We're going to talk about molecules and organelles. We're going to cover this entire range of anatomical complexity. And so when we do, it's important to be able to orient yourself and to say, okay, I'm at the organismal level now, or at the organelle level now. I'm at the tissue level now. Okay, now we're back to the molecular level. Okay, it kind of gives you a blueprint of where we're at in the body and the different structural level that we're talking about. So what are these organ systems that make up the human body, that come together and make up the human body? So let's go through these. The first one consists of the skin, the hair, and the nails. So the organs we find within this organ system includes the skin, the hair, and the nails. And there's also sweat glands. There's also sebaceous or oil glands that are part of this system. This is the integumentary system. We'll stick with the same color here. What about this one? This one consists of the bones of the body, but not just the bones, but the connective tissues that hold those bones together, the joints. And some of those connective tissues include ligaments and cartilage are part of this system as well. What system are we dealing with? This is the skeletal system. The next system consists of the skeletal muscles of the body. The skeletal muscles connect to bone and they produce movement. They contract to produce movement. They also generate heat. What organ system is this? This is the muscular system. And we're going to cover all three of these organ systems in the first quarter of anatomy and physiology. What about this organ system? The brain, the spinal cord, the nerves, and all the different types of neurons that run through there. This is the nervous system, and we're going to spend a bunch of time. We're going to spend a lot of time on the nervous system because the nervous system is basically controlling most things that go on in the body. All the other organ systems, to some level, to some extent, are controlled by the nervous system. What about this organ system? Okay, it's kind of spread out throughout the body. It consists of these different glands, like the thyroid gland that wraps around the neck, the adrenal glands on top of the kidneys, the pancreas, the pituitary gland up in the brain, as well as the pineal gland. The ovaries and testes are also part of this organ system. This is the endocrine system. And all of these endocrine organs and endocrine cells are going to produce chemical messengers called hormones. They're going to release those into the fluids of the body, including the blood. Those hormones are going to travel to distant target tissues and act on distant target tissues to elicit some type of physiological effect. So the endocrine system is another control system in the body, along with the nervous system. But the endocrine system takes much longer to act than the nervous system. The nervous system acts within milliseconds, whereas the endocrine system can take seconds to minutes to hours, up to days, to elicit an effect. The heart, blood vessels, as well as the connective tissue, blood, which is a liquid connective tissue that runs within those blood vessels. What organ system is this? This is the cardiovascular system. Cardio referring to heart, vascular referring to blood vessels. This next picture actually represents two different organ systems. And one of those organ systems consists of lymph nodes, lymphatic vessels, and then lymphoid organs like the thymus, the spleen. Okay, what organ system is this? This is the lymphatic system. And one of the primary jobs of the lymphatic system is to pick up leaked fluid from the circulatory system, to pick up that fluid, to run it through these lymph nodes and vessels, and then return it to the cardiovascular system up near the heart. Another function of the lymphatic system is to provide structure, to provide housing for white blood cells. And so within these lymph nodes, within the spleen and the other lymphoid organs, are millions of white blood cells that are basically there, and that's where they live, and they're there and they're waiting for pathogens to come by to be alerted. And those billions of white blood cells that are found throughout the body represent the immune system. So the immune system doesn't necessarily consist of discrete organs, but it consists of billions and billions of individual white blood cells that live within the lymphatic system. Okay, moving on. The nasal cavity, the larynx, the trachea, which all lead down to the lungs. This is the respiratory system. The oral cavity, esophagus, which leads down to the stomach, the small and large intestine. The liver is also part of this organ system. This is the digestive system. The kidneys. We have a pair of kidneys. We have a pair of ureters. We have a single urinary bladder and a single urethra. This is the urinary system. And when it comes to the physiology of the urinary system, we're going to be talking primarily about the kidneys. Okay, this is where the most of the action occurs at. And it's going to be the job of the kidneys to maintain the chemistry of the blood, to maintain the water balance, the electrolyte balance, and the pH balance of the blood. And it does that by filtering out blood, filtering fluid from the blood, and then returning what's necessary to the blood to maintain that chemistry. And anything that needs to be disposed of is not returned to the blood, but instead it travels down the ureters to the urinary bladder, and it's eliminated from the body through the urethra. And then lastly, and which of these two organ systems you have just depends on your gender. So one of those consists of the testes, which is going to produce sperm and testosterone. And then that sperm is released into these tubes called the ductus deferens. Then they travel through the urethra and out the penis. This is the male reproductive system. And then over here, we have a pair of ovaries. And these ovaries are going to produce eggs and also sex steroids like estrogen and progesterone. Once every about 28 days post-puberty, those ovaries are going to release an egg. They're going to travel down the fallopian or the uterine tubes. And if fertilization occurs, it typically occurs in the fallopian tube. And then that new organism, that zygote, and then that embryo travels down and incubates in the uterus. This is the female reproductive system. And then the next 3 pages are basically filled with individual descriptions of each of these organ systems. And what I would like you to do is to match each of these descriptions with the appropriate organ system. And some of these I've talked about, some you may have to look up, but these are good questions to post on the group discussion and compare answers with other students. So what about this one? Keeps the blood constantly supplied with oxygen and removes carbon dioxide. That's the respiratory system. Allows manipulation of the environment, maintains posture, produces heat. This is the muscular system. Forms the external body covering. Synthesizes vitamin D. There's sensory receptors here, pain receptors, pressure receptors, temperature receptors. Sweat and oil glands are part of this system. That's the integumentary system. Now, it's important to realize that these organ systems, these individual organ systems, do not work in isolation. Okay, there aren't just individual organ systems that are performing their individual functions and that's it. More accurately, these organ systems are working together to perform the functions of the body and to maintain homeostasis, to maintain the appropriate conditions within the body. And we can look at that example. We can look at a pretty good example of that right here. And the idea here is that in order to do work and survive, cells have to generate ATP, adenosine triphosphate. ATP is the chemical form that cells need to perform their work. Heart cells need ATP for contraction of the heart. Nerve cells need ATP for generating electricity. And so all of the cells of the body need ATP to be able to perform their functions. And this happens by a process called cellular respiration. And this is the equation for that. And what's happening here is we're taking glucose, we're combining it with oxygen, or the cells are, and they're converting that to ATP. But there's also some byproducts involved here. Carbon dioxide is a byproduct. Water is a byproduct. Heat is a byproduct. Okay, so let's look at all the organ systems that are involved in just making sure that this happens at the cellular level. So the cells need glucose for cellular respiration. Well, how are they going to get it? Well, first of all, we need to ingest food, and that happens through the digestive system. And then those carbohydrates travel through the digestive system, and we eventually break those carbohydrates down into individual monosaccharides, into individual glucose units. And then those are absorbed across the intestinal wall into the blood. So the first organ system involved here is the digestive system. Then, like I mentioned, that's absorbed into the blood. So then the cardiovascular system takes over. And what does that do? Well, the heart is contracting, which generates pressure, which means that blood is going to flow through the blood vessels. And so it takes those glucose molecules and it gives them access to the different cells of the body. But before these individual cells can take in glucose, we have to involve the endocrine system. And specifically what happens is the pancreas releases insulin. Insulin binds to this cell, and that allows these individual cells to take in glucose inside of the cell so they can undergo cellular respiration. So the endocrine system is involved. What about oxygen? How do these cells get oxygen? Well, we inhale oxygen through the respiratory system. And then that oxygen moves from the lungs into the blood, also through the respiratory system. So we have the respiratory system involved, and then the cardiovascular system takes that oxygen to the individual cells. And then ATP is produced, which the cells use to perform energy. But we also have some byproducts. We have carbon dioxide that's produced. And we need to get rid of that carbon dioxide. If too much CO2 builds up, then the body becomes acidic. And that's a problem. So how do we do that? Well, that CO2 moves from the cells into the interstitial fluid, and then it moves into the blood. Then the cardiovascular system takes it to the lungs. And then the respiratory system exhales that CO2. So we have the cardiovascular system and the respiratory system used to get rid of carbon dioxide. What about heat? Okay, what if we need to maintain a certain body temperature, so what if too much heat is building up? Well, we're going to vasodilate the arteries. We're going to activate sweat glands. Okay, and so the vasodilation of the arteries involves nervous system control of the blood vessels of the cardiovascular system. Activation of sweat glands includes nervous system control of the integumentary system. Okay. The urinary system is also involved in this because these cells are also producing nitrogenous waste and other waste products as a through different cellular metabolic events are producing nitrogenous waste products that we need to get rid of. So those go into the circulatory system and they're taken up by the kidney, and the kidney removes those waste products in the urine. So the whole point here is that the organ systems do not work in isolation, but rather they're working together to perform the functions of the body. And the last important principle I want to talk about with regards to anatomy and physiology is the maintenance of homeostasis, maintaining homeostasis. So what is homeostasis? Well, homeostasis is regulating an internal variable to remain very nearly constant. To have a variable and to maintain that variable within very tight limits. It can go up, it can go down, but it has to be maintained within these very tight limits for the body to be able to function and the organism to be able to survive. So what are some variables that we as humans have to maintain homeostasis over? What is this referring to? Body temperature. If body temperature gets too high, that's a problem, and the body needs to bring it down. How is the body going to do that? Well, we're going to vasodilate the arteries near the skin to release heat. We're going to activate sweat glands. If body temperature gets too low, what are we going to do to elevate body temperature? Well, we're going to vasoconstrict the blood vessels near the skin. We're going to activate shivering of the skeletal muscles to generate heat. What variable is this referring to? Blood pressure. We need to maintain an adequate degree of blood pressure. And why is that important? What happens if blood pressure gets too low? Well, if blood pressure gets too low, then we're not going to have adequate circulation of blood through the blood vessels. And therefore, we can't deliver gases and nutrients to the cells, and we can't pick up waste products. So those cells don't have the improper environment to function, and they're going to die. So that's a problem. So the body detects that, it integrates it, and what's the body going to do to get that blood pressure back up? Well, it's going to increase heart rate. It's going to not only increase heart rate, but it's going to increase the force that the heart is contracting. So it's going to generate more pressure and increase blood pressure. What variable is this referring to? What's this person doing there? Blood sugar. We need to maintain blood sugar within very tight limits. What happens if blood sugar gets too low? Or I guess to start off, a better question is, why do we need sugar in the blood? Why do we need a certain level of sugar always circulating around in the blood? Well, the cells of the body, especially the nervous system, especially the brain, needs a constant supply of glucose. And the blood is where they're going to pull that from. So we need to have a certain level of sugar in the blood at all times. If that's too low, the endocrine system is going to kick in, and the pancreas is going to release a hormone called glucagon. And that glucagon is going to act on the liver and tell the liver to release sugar, to release glucose into the blood. What about if your blood sugar gets too high? When would your blood sugar get too high? Well, how about after a meal? So how's the body going to bring it down? Well, in this case, the pancreas is going to release insulin into the blood, and insulin allows the cells of the body to take glucose out of the blood and take it into the cell. So the cells are grabbing glucose from the blood and bringing it inside the cell, which lowers blood sugar. And what is this very important variable that we're regulating here? pH. We need the pH of the body fluids, the interstitial fluid, the intracellular fluid in the blood, the plasma, to be within very tight limits. And that's usually around pH 7. If pH drops, if it becomes acidic, or if it gets too high, it becomes basic, then that's a problem. And why is that the case? One of the main reasons that's the case is because the body is made up of all sorts of different proteins. And those proteins are in what we call a three-dimensional structure. This is their functional state. And that protein can be a hormone, it can be an antibody, it can be muscle tissue, anything like that. And to exist in this three-dimensional state, the pH has to be correct. The chemical bonds here that fold this protein in its three-dimensional state need to have the proper pH to exist. If pH gets too high or it gets too low, then these chemical bonds break and the protein unfolds to what it's called its primary or its linear structure. And now this protein is non-functional. So if your pH gets too high or too low, the proteins of the body denature and they're not able to do their job. Enzymes are a great example of this. They're proteins that need a proper pH to function. So if your pH gets too high, or it gets too low, how's the body going to correct that? And this is a pretty complex maintenance of homeostasis. The body fluids have chemical buffers in them that resist changes in pH, and that's immediate. But if that doesn't work, then the respiratory system becomes involved. Maybe we increase our breathing rate to exhale more CO2 to bring that pH back to where it needs to be. And if that doesn't work, then the urinary system is going to be involved. And that's more long-term maintenance of pH. And over the next 2 quarters of Anatomy and Physiology, we will talk about all of these and all of the organ systems that are involved in maintaining each of these homeostatic variables.